All right, one more video for Unit 11. This is going to start out with your lecture questions, Volume 5, Chapter 6, pages 128 to 138. And the first question you have there, what new invention had perhaps the most widespread and large-scale use during World War II? Well, first of all, a little bit about just some of the weaponry that was used in World War II. Tanks, very commonly used as a way of sometimes transporting troops, but not so much transporting troops as much as getting more heavy artillery around. All sorts of different kind of tanks were used. These are just the U.S. ones. Some of them used a lot more commonly than others. This one right here, this is the M4 Sherman. That was the most commonly used tank that the U.S. had. A little bit dependent on just kind of variety of circumstance. Some is lighter armor stuff, some of these a little bit smaller, but yeah, the M4 Sherman was the most common one. So tanks used very widely. Aircraft really came into its own in World War II as well. It's just a few years before the U.S. entered the war that the jet engine was invented. A little side note on that: the BMW logo. The BMW logo is a circle, and it's split up into four quadrants basically: blue, white, blue, white. And what that logo represents is it represents the blue represents the sky, and the white represents propellers that are turning as they go through the sky. And BMW started out as an engine manufacturing company of engines for airplanes. And they were one of the early developers of some of the jet engines that could go really fast, really high. And they were one of the leaders in that, making the jet engines for Germany. But then after, oh, wait a second. I'm suddenly, no, yeah. After World War II, and the war ended, BMW was still a company, but the Allied countries basically said, "Yeah, we don't want you making jet engines anymore because we don't want Germany having that kind of technology that they could possibly continue to weaponize." And so BMW's like, "All right, well, we got to find something else to do." I'm like, "Well, we're really good at manufacturing stuff made out of model. How about we start to make cars instead?" And they became a car manufacturing company. Anyway, you had some really big bombers like this. It was not a very envied position to be the tail gunner there at the back because the fighters were coming up behind. They had the highest mortality rate of any of the positions on a bomber. But yeah, everything from bombers to a lot smaller fighters that were used in the war. Other weapons that just individual soldiers would use: machine guns, flamethrowers, grenades, just a lot of different weaponry. But the answer to this question is actually radar. It was another one of the new things, although it could have been used earlier in World War One if Edison had let the War Department listen to Tesla. But Edison didn't like Tesla, and so he shut that down. So radar didn't end up being a thing until World War II. But it was used for locating the position of airplanes in the sky as well as the position of submarines underwater. That's more technically sonar, I believe. All right, so that's that one. Moving on, we have some stuff about the war in the Pacific. So here's the United States over here, this big Pacific Ocean. And then over here we have Asia. And this line here represents the farthest advance that Japan had gotten during the war. So here's this Manchuria area over here, and then a little bit into China, this part of China, this Korea there, and then all the way down here. This is what was called French Indochina at the time. It's now Vietnam. And yeah, Malaysia down here, and a bunch of these islands along in here. So they made it pretty far. The red lines here represent some of the what they did coming down to attack at Pearl Harbor. And then the blue lines are more what ended up being called island hopping. The United States would secure possession of an island, use it as they needed to for airstrips for landing planes when they weren't able to or didn't want to land on aircraft carriers. and then another island, another island, another island, another island, with the main goal of getting islands close enough to launch an attack directly onto Japan. So that was that. You have the lecture question number 2. Who was the U.S. Chief of Staff of Army during the war? I don't have a picture of him here. His name comes up a little bit here, but we talk about him a little bit more a little bit later. But his name was George C. Marshall. George C. Marshall. Later on, we'll also talk about the Marshall Plan in the context of the Cold War. But Marshall, Marshall. So yeah, George C. Marshall. Number 3, who was U.S. Naval Commander of the Pacific. The guy overall in charge of the Pacific was this guy right here, and his name is Chester Nimitz. Chester, and last name Nimitz, Nimitz. N as in November, Imitz, Chester Nimitz. There's a Nimitz class aircraft carrier, I think, now that is based on him. There was a pretty good. Oh, it was I think it was called Midway, movie that just came out pretty recently called Midway. Has one of the Jonas brothers in it. It has what's the guy's name? Um Woody Harrelson, that some of you might know from Hunger Games as Hamish from the Hunger Games. He played this guy, Chester Nimitz. Um, Gripping movie. It shows a little bit about some of what happened with Pearl Harbor, but then it showed just a little bit about the intelligence side and a little bit about the naval side of this battle for, I think, the Battle of Midway. Really, really important battle. And I think still stands to this day as the largest naval battle in history. So yeah, that was involving Chester Nimitz. And then number 5, who was Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific. So that's a lot of this stuff here. So this guy, Chester Nimitz, was in charge of everything involving the Pacific. And then this guy right here is is hold on a second. I just had a different first name come to mind. MacArthur, General MacArthur. I had John MacArthur come to mind. I was like, wait a second. No, no, no. John MacArthur is the pastor and writer down in Southern California. Why am I drawing? Douglas D. MacArthur was this guy here. And he grew up in the Philippines. He was there in the Philippines when, so the Philippines, hold on a second, down here. He was at the Philippines when the Japanese took control of the Philippines, but he was able to flee and get out. There were others who were not able to, and it was just brutal the way the Japanese treated the people, that the Americans that they had captured there in the Philippines. I mean, I remember seeing some interviews with some kids. Well, at the time they were kids. They were, elderly adults, but of just they thankfully survived, but they almost starved to death. Partway through that, they would kind of amuse themselves by playing a game where they would press down on their stomach and feel their backbone, because they were so starved and so skinny that it just took just a little bit of pressing down where around where their stomach was, and they could literally feel their backbone from the front of their body. A lot of others killed, a lot of others tortured. There's the Bataan Death March. That was something else that happened there. The island fighting. Oh, MacArthur, by the way, your answer for number 5. His last name is spelled Macarthur. Douglas D. MacArthur. So yeah, he had to leave the Philippines. He had this famous quote along the lines of I shall return," of saying, "I'm not going to give up on the Philippine people or the Americans who are captured here. We will fight and we will get back here." A lot of the fighting in the Pacific, as far as the fighting on the islands goes, was just very brutal from the standpoint of the Japanese would build tunnels, underground tunnels, all over the place on these islands. And so American forces would land, and oftentimes there'd be no visible enemy, and all of a sudden there's enemy troops, Japanese troops, coming out of these holes and caves and just hidden exit points to get out of the tunnels. And then they would attack and then they would retreat. And it was hard to find them, it was hard to engage them. And the Japanese also had this mentality of the country comes first, our service to our country, our service to our emperor comes first, and my own safety comes second. And the Japanese kind of knew the numbers of like if every other one of our soldiers can kill one American soldier before our Japanese soldiers die, then that will be enough. And they were very willing to sacrifice themselves, oftentimes, for the cause of their country. And you see that a little bit also with the kamikazes, the practice of the pilots of Japanese planes when they sometimes knew that they were down, sometimes just the circumstances called for it as a strategy, where they would intentionally fly their airplanes and try to fly them into a ship in order to blow up the plane and sink the ship, sink one of the American ships. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the Pacific Campaign, um, Chester Arthur, and Douglas D. MacArthur. Switching gears, there was the Allied invasion into Europe in order to take control of France and then push into Germany to try to end the war with Germany. And so this is England here, there's London up there. And this is the northwestern coast of France. This is the area of France called Normandy, and these were the different beaches where Allied troops landed. There was Sword, Juno, Gold, Omaha. Omaha was the worst one, and Utah. Those are the five beaches that were the key places where troops landed. And yeah, so this was the Normandy invasion, also called D-Day. D-Day, the D just stands for day. It's one of those things kind of like 9/11. 9/11 is just a date, September 11th, but when people say 9/11, they know you're talking about, oh, the 9/11, like the September 11th, 2001 9/11, the World Trade Center 9/11. Same thing with D-Day. D-Day is just a common military terminology that is used to refer to whatever the day we end up attacking. That is D-Day. Whatever operation it is, the day that we launch the operation, it's D-Day. It is the day. The D again stands for day. And so if it's 2 days before the operation, it's like, well, this is D-Day -2. Then if it's the first day after the operation began, it's D-Day +1. Is kind of how they use that terminology. And they would use that because oftentimes the exact date wouldn't be known. And so they wouldn't refer to a particular date, and they wouldn't want to use like particular information or names of the operation or something like that to try to keep stuff secret. And so they would just call, well, D-Day for this operation, and that kind of a thing. But this was like such an important, such a big, such a massive D-Day that is just called D-Day. It's the D-Day. And then similar, H hour would be the exact hour that an operation is supposed to begin. You have like it's H -4 when it's 4 hours before the hour that the operation is set to begin, kind of stuff. This guy here is Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was the general. He was the, how does your question put it? This is number 4, who was Supreme Commander of Allied Forces of the Normandy Invasion. This is Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower spelled Eisenhower. And here he is talking to, wait, that doesn't seem right. Captain America wasn't actually in World War II. Hold on a second. Ah, there we go. Okay, here's the real image. Dwight D. Eisenhower talking to some of the soldiers. I don't know. I think this particular image is shortly before they loaded up to launch across the English Channel in order to get to the beaches of Normandy. And we'll read a book about D-Day later in the year. I mentioned that in the previous video, and it is some story about the plans for how it went down, about the weight, about the transportation, about the paratroopers landing the night before in order to secure some stuff behind the lines, about the soldiers landing and just how brutal the fighting was. Here you have a little image of what it was like. They were on these landing craft that had this kind of like trailer hitch, or not trailer hitch, tailgate kind of a thing that could flop down in order for them to get out. They would hope that they would be close enough to the beach because they were usually loaded down with anywhere from 80 or something like 80 or 100 pounds of weight on their backs. And but as this thing flops down, sometimes there's machine gun fire coming from bunkers that the Germans had manned, and so it's like you're going out into water, trying to get up onto a beach, trying to find some kind of cover, all while hoping that you are in shallow enough water that you could walk, so you don't end up drowning, hoping that you don't get shot right when you get. And yeah, that's um, casualties were pretty bad on D-Day. Okay, that's a little bit about that. And then North Africa. There's also some fighting in North Africa. It was originally the Italians who had most of the possession of North Africa, and then the Germans also came and brought some support. And you have just a little bit of overview of some of the aspects of where some of the movements were and where some of the battles took place here in North Africa. I have this picture here to kind of represent what the terrain sometimes looked like, and it was just a lot of tank warfare. And one of the main guys for the United States was General Patton. It's spelled for you right there, Patton, General Patton. That's him right there. And he was just one of those, just like, go get him, kind of rough and tumble, but just in many ways a great general. Um, Kind of ironic, I guess, in a sense. He survived to the end of the war. He was in Berlin after the end of the war, just helping with different aspects of overseeing troops. And he was just on his way to go pheasant hunting with another officer when they got into a car accident, and the movement of his body as he was sitting in the back seat of the car, it smashed his head into like a glass partition between the front and the back of the car, and it fractured some vertebrae. It caused nerve damage, and I think it was 2 days later. Well, and it paralyzed him. But he ended up dying of different aspects of heart and lung failure 2 days later. So here he survived the whole war, all of these battles and everything like that, and he gets into a relatively minor car accident shortly after the war ended and died. So this is related to the answer to number 6, who was field commander in North Africa. That's General Patton. And then just a little bit more stuff wrapping up things about the war. There was the Battle of the Bulge. You have some reading questions about that. And so Germany did kind of one final push out here into parts of Luxembourg and Belgium, and the United States had to beat them back. This was a model of the underground Hitler's bunker that he had, and that was where he died. Yeah, Berlin was getting taken, and he didn't want to get captured. He didn't want to have to face trial and execution. And he had his mistress that I think he married like just beforehand, and they decided to commit suicide. And they had suicide pills, and he and she took those. Although before he took them, he was kind of paranoid that the different ways of that he would try to kill himself wouldn't do the job well enough. And so first he gave one of the suicide pills to his dog to make sure that it killed the dog, and then he gave it to himself. But even then he's like, well, I think I might survive this, and so he also shot himself. I've been in Berlin to the site where this is. It's just kind of like partially a parking lot and partially a couple of other buildings that are all built on top of where this is. And there's just this little like informational thing that is there, and just like, this is the site of Hitler's bunker that is there in Berlin. Yeah, Berlin is both kind of a cool city, but also is kind of sad because Hitler he wanted to completely create a new history for Germany, and so he demolished tons of the old cool buildings in Berlin, and he was planning to spend tons of money to completely rebuild Berlin with here's the new way of our architecture, and we're writing a new history for ourselves. And so it's kind of sad that a lot of their old history got destroyed. So that's that. The Allies finally pushed into Germany and took Berlin and were able to end the war. And yeah, so that's Victory in Europe. VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. And then VJ Day is Victory over Japan. And the United States had made it farther and farther closer to Japan as far as taking different islands go. And they knew the Japanese mentality, and they knew ish the size of the Japanese army, and they were calculating the casualties if they tried to continue traditional warfare. Meanwhile, the atomic bomb had been invented. The Manhattan Project is its own just fascinating story, but won't spend time on that right now. But the atomic bomb had been developed partially because the British and the Americans had gotten word that the Germans might be working on developing how to build an atomic bomb. This is based on somewhat on Einstein's work of the relationship between matter and energy and being able to create a nuclear chain reaction that will release some of the energy that is bound up in the nucleus of an atom, and they knew it would be tremendously destructive, and whoever got the atomic bomb first might secure victory in the war. And they really didn't want, obviously, the Germans to be able to do that, so they worked on it. But then the question began to be deliberated of should we use this in Japan, because we theoretically could cause there to be not nearly as many casualties. They estimated that using the atomic bomb, while it would kill a lot of people, would in the end perhaps result in 1 million fewer casualties. But it would involve a lot more civilians being killed. And I'm sure that was not an easy decision to make, and I still am not completely decided on whether or not that was an okay thing to do. It is true that both the Germans and the Americans and British had all gone the direction of more of like a total war kind of direction. The Germans bombing cities in England, the British and Americans started to bomb cities in Germany, including like killing civilians, because there's this mindset of both countries are going to keep going until we entirely remove their motivation to keep fighting, and we need to also remove the civilians' support of their country. And so, if we can cause more devastation to the cities within the country, then maybe more people will say, we have to stop fighting this war. Japan did some direct attacks on America. It's actually some of the only, hold on a second, casualties and devastation caused on American soil is Japan earlier in the war had tried attaching explosives to balloons and also like incendiary devices, things that would cause fires onto balloons and places where they knew that the air currents would carry the balloons over to American soil. And some of those caused some fires, caused a little bit of damage, but overall not much. Anyway, the leaders of the Allies ended up deciding to drop bombs. They decided to go for two locations where there was at least a lot of like factories that supported the military for Japan, and those were the cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. This is the city of Kobe right here. That's where Kobe Bryant was born. Kyoto, and you can't see it on this map. It's a little bit farther up and to the right is where Tokyo is. So these are replicas of the bombs that were dropped. This is the Fat Man, and this is the Little Boy. If I recall correctly, Fat Man was dropped on Hiroshima, and Little Boy was dropped on Nagasaki. Between the two cities combined, there were somewhere in the range of 100 to 150,000 casualties, the vast majority of them civilians. About half of the people died in the explosions themselves, and then about half of them died within a few days after that from radiation poisoning. Here you have one image that kind of shows a little bit of the before and after. You can mainly can see that church building there, but all sorts of buildings there. And then here's that same church building, and it's pretty much just leveled. And then this picture here is showing some of the surrender ceremonies of the Japanese surrendering to the Allies to officially end the war. And with Germany having surrendered and Japan having surrendered, that was it. You might be wondering, what about Italy? Well, what happened in Italy is the Italian people finally revolted and they captured Mussolini and they hanged Mussolini and they kind of joined the Allied side a little bit. They at least stopped being aggressors in the war like that. Um, just a second, I'm double checking your reading questions. Okay, that's that, that's that. Okay, that's all that I wanted to cover here. There are a few other things like some of the espionage aspects of the war. You saw a little bit with the like blow up inflatable balloons, inflatable tanks and stuff like that that they would set around to convince the enemy that they were in one place when really they were another, that they had more supplies and weapons on hand than they did. There's other stuff about convincing the Germans that the Allies were going to land in one place in Italy when they were going to land in another place in Italy by finding a guy who died of some kind of poisoning in the United States in a way that his lungs filled up with water that would look like he drowned, and then taking that person, creating an entire false identity for him, even like writing letters that he supposedly wrote to like his girlfriend back home, and then letters that the girlfriend supposedly wrote, and then creating false documentation that he was an officer, and then handcuffing a briefcase to him that had all of the like secret plans about where they were going to land, but they were actually fake plans, and then studying the ocean currents so that they knew, oh, if we drop his body in the water in this place, he will wash up in a beach in a place where the Germans are likely to find him. And sure enough, the Germans found him. They investigated, and they're like, this seems like this real officer. And they got the briefcase open. They're like, these are real plans. And stuff like that was also going on with part of the war. But that wraps it up for now. And we'll talk about World War II a little bit more with that book. And then otherwise, we are moving on. So I'll let you know what things are going to look like next week for a test on Unit 11. Otherwise, let me know if you have any questions, and hope you're doing well.